Ezekiel, the prophet, had something to say about today. He says, "By my life, I do not wish the sinner to die, says the Lord, but to turn to me and to live." I have a story to tell, and it's a very personal story. And I'll just tell it and we'll see where it goes. My father was very sick at one point, had been in the hospital. They lived in Lake Worth, Florida. And I was down there, I was coming down to give a retreat in Lake Worth, Florida at the Cenacle. And as I went down there, the sign on the door of our house was, "We're over in the hospital." So I went over to the hospital, and I saw my father and my mother, and we talked for a while. He looked like he was doing, okay. So I said, well, I'm going to give the retreat, and when I'm finished, I'll come back and, spend a few days. So I did. I came back to the house. And one night, we were having dinner. And before the dinner, my mother was making the dinner in the kitchen, and my father and I were sitting in the living room and talking just a little bit, and then the talking stopped. And I looked at my father, and I don't know why I did this, but I looked at him, and I said, "How do you feel about dying?" And he said, "Well, I'm afraid." I said, "Well, what are you afraid of?" And he said, "I don't know. I never died before." So I said, "Well, what do you think about God?" And he said, "Well, I believe in God." And then I said, "Anything else?" And he said, "Well, I don't know what to think about God. I do believe, but I just don't know what to think." And I said, "Well, what do you think?" And he said, "Well, I guess I'm a little afraid of God." I said, "What are you afraid of?" And he said, "Again, I don't know. But I just don't know enough of what God is about." So I said, "Well, let me tell you about God." So I said, in the book of Isaiah, the Old Testament, the people are complaining that God isn't hearing them. Where is God? And so on and so forth. Why has God abandoned us? And as that goes on, then Isaiah says, speaking for God, can a mother forget her child? Can she forget the one that she gave birth to and nursed? And even if a mother could forget her child, I, God, can never forget you. I've got you in the palm of my hand. So I said to my father, "Look at your hand." And he looked at it, and I said, "You see all the lines? You're the lines in the hand of God. Wherever the palm of the hand is, God, there are the lines. And wherever the lines are, there is God." So he listened, and I said, it reminds me of this family that I knew when I lived up in Chicago. And they had a little boy whose name was Billy. This is not about Father Billy, by the way. This wouldn't have happened with him. But a little boy named Billy, and his father would take him by the waist, and he'd throw him up in the air and catch him. And he'd throw him in the air and catch him. And he'd say, "More." And so he'd take him by the wrists and he'd flip him up there. This little guy was about not even a year old, or maybe a year and going on 2. But he was flipping him in the air, and Billy was yelling and screaming and laughing and joking, and then he'd take him by the feet and do the same thing. Pretty much for something scary to do. Well, little Billy was having a great time. He loved what was going on. He just wanted more and more and more. But do you think that little Billy, I was telling my dad, you think little Billy, while he's flying in the air, is thinking, now, is my father going to be there to catch me? Little Billy knew in his bones that his father would be there. He didn't have to think it through. He was just there. I said, no. God is just there. And then I spoke with him about when I was a little kid. And there's five siblings in the family. And 2 of them are older. So two brothers of mine and myself are much younger. And my parents would go out for an evening. And when they'd leave, they'd put us each in a different room because we would have a great time if they didn't. And so they'd be each in their, we would each be in our rooms. And I remember I would be sound asleep when they came back. And then I can still remember it, my father picking me up and holding me and putting me on his shoulder, so my head was looking back that way. And then he would walk me down the corridor to the bedroom and put me into bed and cover me and kiss me goodnight and then leave. And I said to my father, you did that for me. And I said, and you can do wrong. But God does that for us. And God can do no wrong. So this conversation went on for quite a while. A good half hour, almost an hour. And in that, we finished, my mother overheard the whole conversation from the kitchen. Never said a word. And then we had dinner together. Then we all went back into the living room. We talked for a while. And they had the television set on. And then at one point, it was time to go to bed. So it was early for me, but it wasn't for them. So with that, they both got up and walked into the bedroom. And I was sitting right near the doorway that went into the corridor, into the bedroom. So they both got up. My mother walked out first. And then my father followed her. And as he followed, he passed me and stopped. And all he did was put his hand on my shoulder and looked down at me. And just went with his head shaking like this. And then walked into the bedroom. The next day, we all got up, and I had to take the flight back to Chicago. I was going to give a retreat up there. And so I went up to Chicago, and I stayed at the Cenacle in Chicago, where I'd given many retreats before. And while I was there, the next day I was to begin the retreat, but it wouldn't begin until late in the afternoon. So I had some time that day, and I was figuring out what did I want to do. So one of the sisters came to me and said, you know, I got some tickets to go to the art museum. And we're not going to use them. Why don't you take the ticket? I said, oh, I'd love to do that. I used to go to that any number of different times. So we got the ticket, and I went down, drove down, and went to park the car, and went into the art museum, which is right on the lakefront. And I got to the art museum, I walked up the stairs, and as I got to the doors of the art museum, I thought, I don't know if I want to do this. So I thought I couldn't go through the doors. So I turned around and I decided not to go. And I went down the steps and I thought, no, I do want to go. That's why I came over here. So I went back there, I went to the door, and again I was stopped. I mean, I just couldn't go in. And I didn't know why. So I stood there for a few moments, and then I turned around, and I went down the stairs, I didn't go back. And there's a park next to the famous area there in Chicago, on the lakefront. And I went over to the park, and there's a beautiful fountain called the Buckingham Fountain. And it is a magnificent fountain, it's huge. And then these sprays go up, and the fountain shoots up, and I walked over there. I'd seen that many times. So I just walked over there, and as I stood there, watching all this, then it was like the world disappeared. And I don't know what happened next, except I just was standing there. And I don't know how long I stood there. And then all of a sudden, everything came back together. And I thought, well, I've got to get out to the Senecal on the west side of Chicago. I better go now. So I got my car, drove to the Senecal, parked my car, and there was a nun waiting to welcome me at the front door. So I walked up, and she said, I have some bad news for you. And I said, what? She said, your father died. And I said, well, when did he die? And then she said, the time was like 1 o'clock or 2 in the afternoon. And when she said that, that's when I was at the fountain. Exactly at that time. And it was at the fountain that I had this experience that I have a hard time remembering, but I remembered it as an experience of a profound peace. And it was the same time my father died. So I registered it in my mind and kept it there, and I didn't say anything. And then sometime later, I went back to Lake Worth, Florida. I wanted to see how my mother was doing. At that time I was living in Atlanta. And I got back there and we talked, and she was having a tough time. And then I told her this story. And I was telling her the story, she just was kind of shaking her head. And she said, you know, your father, after you had that conversation, which I heard, she said, after you had that, and we went to bed that night, she said, he said to me, before going to bed, now, Bob did something for me, and I will never forget. So I've got to do something for him. And I told her that whole story of the fountain, and then realized this was a moment, a very quiet moment, a very peaceful moment, in which my father, in some way, had communicated to me his thanks. So there's things that go on in our lives that sometimes we don't recognize at the time how significant they are, and some changes that take place in our lives. And we can't put anything together to pull it all together, but nevertheless those changes take place. And sometimes they're profound changes. Well, I was then, years later, I became the pastor of Holy Ghost Church in Hammond, Louisiana. And I was there as pastor for over 13 years. And I used to get my hair cut by a person that I knew, I met. His name was Joe the Barber. So I went to Joe, the barber, and through the years got to know him quite well, and his wife. And they were getting a little bit older. And we would talk at times, and I would visit them in the house at various times. And her name was Althea. So one day I had a call from one of Althea's children, and Joe's children, that she was in the hospital. Now I had seen her before in the hospital, and on and off. But I went right over to the hospital to see her. And the room was filled with her family. And I walked into the room, and she was lying on the bed, and she had a mask, for oxygen, and it covered everything, so she couldn't talk. But I noticed when I saw her, her eyes were bulging out. She was absolutely frightened of what was happening. She knew, you could tell by looking at her eyes. She was scared to death of dying. And so I asked everybody to leave the room except her husband, Joe. So he was on one side of the bed, and I was on the other side. And she was looking at me. And I said, Althea, I know you can't talk. I know you're frightened. But everything is going to be okay. And then I told her, and I mentioned something about that story that I just told you, about my father. And I said, do you remember the story I told you about my father? And what happened? And I went through the story again with her. And as I was going through the story, I could see, but her husband said to me quietly, in a whisper, from the other side of the bed, she's changing. She's changing. Look at her eyes. And they were at peace. And then the next day she died. The Lord is with us. Never leaves us. I'm with you all days. I'll never go away. I'm here. I just want you to know that I'm here. I had that experience. Althea died peacefully the next day. God is a God who loves. God is a God who loves us. God is a God, as I said yesterday, that all he wanted to do was to bring God's own kingdom to the earth. And that is a kingdom, ultimately, of peace. That's what God is about. God cares for us enough that God in some ways is like my father who helped me, who carried me. God is like the story I told to my father about Billy. And so we have this incredible God who only wants to bring the kingdom. Now, when God brought about the kingdom, he brought about it in the strangest of ways. As we talked about it yesterday, God came to somebody, came to all those people while he was on the cross. And some of them were shouting and screaming and yelling and telling him to come down from the cross. They didn't like him, they hated him. But he was still there. He couldn't get off the cross. He was still there. God is always still there. No matter what happens, I'm still there. And I always will be. So, Jesus was on the cross, the visible image of the invisible God. And reaching down and saying to those beneath the cross, who were saying and mocking him, "Come down from the cross yourself if you're God." And he couldn't. And yet he said, "Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing." This is the kind of a God that we have. God comes to us, not we go to God. We might be searching for God and wanting God and help me God and so on and so forth, and that's just fine. But we don't do it on our own. God acts first. God always acts first. God comes to us in our time and our space and our place. No matter what's happening, what's going on, whether we're living wonderfully or not living wonderfully. If we're going through all kinds of difficulties and troubles and sorrows and pain, and we say to ourselves, "I don't think I can take anymore." And yet this God says, "I meet you there. I don't meet you after you're through it all. I meet you right where you are. And I will always do that." And let me tell you something God could say to us. You remember what I did on the cross? Do you remember the two people that were crucified next to me? And do you remember that I was there for them? And do you remember that one of the criminals turned to me and said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom"? I was there for him at that moment, the most miserable, awful moment of the life of that criminal and the life of Jesus. They met on a cross, not before that. Didn't even know his name. And he said, "I'm here." And he said, in response to the criminal, "You'll be with me." The God we have is a kind of strange God. A strange God that surprises us so often. And especially the surprise when things aren't going very well. When things are tough. When I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed in my life with myself or with my husband, my spouse. I'm disappointed with my children at times. I don't know what to do. I don't know why they're so confused and so on and so forth. I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that her family is broken up. Well, that might be. And yet at the same time, that is exactly where God meets us. He basically says, "You are not alone." And that criminal on the cross, that's what he discovered. I'm not alone like I thought I was. And then turned in the only direction he could turn and say, "Please remember me when you come into your kingdom." We can say that for ourselves. Each of us sitting here, God meets you now. Not where you'd like to be, and not where you want to be, but where you are. So he meets you now, and yet this is maybe the most powerful time, not the most powerful time, but there are other ones, and maybe the most powerful times, like Althea, when she gets close to death and is scared to death of what's going on, and God meets her right there, in the words, in a sense, of the story. That God is with us, will never abandon us. Is like a mother, never leaves us alone. This is the God we have. And we don't necessarily respond real well. And God says, I'm not asking for that. I hope you do the best you can. But we're all sinners. And it doesn't work out that way all the time. And then God says, it's okay, I'm here. And then another crazy thing that happens is that with that, then we say, okay, God, I trust you and I love you and so on and so forth. I place myself in your hands, but I'm going to end up in purgatory. Why do I have to be punished if you love me so much? Well, am I being punished? Is that what this is about? The great thing about whatever purgatory is, it's not a place of punishment. It's a place of mercy. That sometimes I haven't finished opening myself to God, and God says, let me help you. Let me help you. And if you can't accomplish it before you die, I'll help you accomplish it afterwards. Do not be afraid. I'm with you always, no matter what. No matter where you go and what you do. And just think, for the criminal, he was born on a cross. When he turned to Jesus, and he said, that we sang yesterday. And so, let us sing it once more. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.